Good. So I'm excited to be here today. It's good to see you all. And what I'll be talking about today and sharing with you is how it is that today Muslims are drawing on Islam or their tradition to think about environmental responsibility, think about sort of Muslim environmentalism. And as you can see from this first slide, I have there in quotes, all the earth is a mosque. This is actually a quote taken from a prophetic hadith. So a hadith is a report of the saying and doing of the Prophet Muhammad. And this was taken from him when he was discussing where one could do ritual prayer. And he said, essentially, anywhere and everywhere on the earth. And so this hadith, this part of this hadith, has been taken by Muslims today who are concerned with the environment, and historically within Islam, to sort of represent this way in which all the earth is sacred. And so as a Muslim conducting ritual prayer, so one of the 5 daily prayers, you could do that, of course, in the mosque, you can do it at home, but you can do it anywhere outside, because all the earth is a mosque. So most of you want to go to the next slide. And so what I'll do in my time today is to share a few concepts from the Quran. We might say sort of a Quranic worldview when it comes to the environment, and ways in which, again, Muslim thinkers, Muslim communities are drawing on the Quran today to deal with climate change, to sort of conceptualize solutions and practices to deal with climate change. And then I want to talk a little bit about, too, how that's been translated into Islamic law, actually what's today called Islamic environmental law. And then they kind of close with a couple of examples of kind of legal, actually, fatwas that have been issued to address environmental concerns today. I'll begin, though, with a story. And actually, this connects to our prelude. You can always count on trees. Well, the Prophet Muhammad would agree. And so there's a story from the life of the Prophet Muhammad where when the community moved from Mecca, actually immigrated, they were refugees fleeing from Mecca to Medina because they were persecuted in Mecca. And so they fled to Medina to establish themselves there. And before a mosque had been built, the Prophet Muhammad would preach under a date palm tree, like one you see here. And he would preach under this tree. And eventually the mosque was built. And so then he transitioned, had a pulpit built for the mosque. And as the story goes, the tree began to weep because it missed the Prophet Muhammad preaching under it. It was saddened by this, so it began to weep. And the Prophet Muhammad could hear this, was aware of this. And he would come soothe the tree. And according to one version of the hadith, or of the story, he had the tree actually moved to where it could continue to hear him preach. So we see with this story, this way in which the natural world, trees are sacred, the ways in which the earth, the natural world, has a kind of agency, right? Is living. And this will be sort of central to sort of Quranic worldview, right? This way in which humans have been given responsibility to care for the earth. But part and parcel of that is the fact that all of creation is alive and worships God along with us, right? We are not the only ones worshiping God, right? All of creation worships God. So next slide, please. So hopefully you all can read that. It might be a little bit small. I'll read this for everyone. But in terms of a few Quranic concepts, ideas from the Quran that Muslims are drawing on today, again, to sort of think about sort of environmental responsibility. So the first is this idea of stewardship. And so the term used for that is a khalifa. And so maybe you've heard of a caliph or caliphate. So kind of within the history of Islam, there are different periods when you'd have a caliphate. But within the Quran, actually, we are all caliphs. You're a caliph, I'm a caliph. And it's this idea within the Quran that all humans have been assigned this role as stewards or vice regents of creation, otherwise known as caliphs. And so a verse often used to sort of get at this idea is from the second chapter of the Quran, verse 30. And it says this. It says, "And when your Lord said to the angels, 'Indeed, I will make upon the earth a successive authority, a khalifa,' they said," that is, the angels said, "Will you place upon it one who causes corruption therein and sheds blood while we exalt you with praise and declare your perfection?" God said, "Indeed, I know that which you do not." So this verse is really interesting for a couple of reasons. And one is that we see here, very explicitly that humans have been given this responsibility of stewardship. Right? We are stewards, we are caliphs, right, to care for this earth. But you also see the angels here who are basically questioning God about this, sort of asking him, "God, are you sure? Are you sure that's what you really want to do?" Because when we see humans, we aren't quite sure if they're able to take care of the earth. And, right, will you place upon it one who causes corruption and sheds blood? And so the angels are already expressing a kind of skepticism towards whether or not we can actually care for this world. But God says, "Indeed, I know that which you do not." And so God says, but I know. Right? But there's a kind of ambivalence towards this idea of humans as stewards of creation. So, and also worthy of note is this idea of dominion. So in Genesis, in the Hebrew Bible, Christian Old Testament, it's, this sort of idea of dominion, right? Humans are given dominion over the earth. And of course, Christians, environmentally conscious Christians today would kind of really emphasize this idea of stewardship as opposed to dominion. But still, the Hebrew word there is dominion. And sort of an interesting difference with the Quran is that in terms of dominion, there is a term for that in the Quran. Mulk is the Arabic for that. And only God has ever spoken of us having dominion. Only God. Humans are never given dominion. Humans are only spoken of as being stewards. Next slide, please. So another concept that's being drawn on, current concept being drawn on by Muslims today, is this idea of a balance or a measure. The term for that is mizan. So we can think about kind of a scale, right? Or a scale where one wants to maintain things in balance. And sort of idea that on the day of judgment, right, we will be held accountable according to our deeds, right? And our deeds we put into sort of balance, whether or not our good deeds, our good intentions, which is also actually really important, whether they outweigh our bad deeds, right? So we'll be held accountable. But Muslims today have been drawing on sort of idea also to talk about how we need to maintain a proper balance with creation. That all of creation exists in sort of harmony and a balance. And when we act in a way that upsets that balance, right, then we are not maintaining the proper balance. Right? So we are there to help maintain that balance, to encourage that balance of creation. And when we act in ways that cause it to get out of whack, when we have sort of ecosystem disasters, when we disrupt ecosystems, well, then we are in fact getting in the way of maintaining that balance. And so this verse says, in the heaven he raised, so in heaven God raised and imposed the balance, that you not transgressed within the balance, and established weight and justice, and do not make deficient the balance. So again, this idea of justice, of balance, and this has also been a concept that Muslims have been drawing on for thinking about environmental justice, environmental responsibility. Next slide, please. So this is sort of in contrast to this idea of corrupting the earth. Corrupting the earth. Just sort of facade for corrupting and then art for earth. And so when we don't maintain a proper balance between ourselves and all creation, then what are we doing? Well, we are corrupting the earth. So this verse says here, but seek through that which God has given you the home of hereafter, and yet do not forget your share of the world, and do good as God has done good to you, and desire not corruption in the land, facade for the art, Indeed, God is not like the corruptors. And so this idea of corrupting, it's multivalent. It can mean not only in terms of shedding each other's blood, taking advantage of others, but it can also mean in the way that Muslims are taking it today to mean is that pollution, right? Actual corruption of the natural world. And so this is seen as something that, of course, we are commanded to avoid. Next slide, please. And so the final sort of Quranic verse or idea, this idea of a trust or a covenant. So it's somewhat similar to this idea of Khalifa or being a vice regent, but also a little bit different. And so the term here is amana. Amana, the Arabic term. And this is another interesting verse. We can spend a lot of time unpacking this actually. And it says this: indeed, we offered the trust, or amana, to the heavens and the earth and the mountains, and they declined to bear it and feared it. But man, right, humans, undertook to bear it. Indeed, he was unjust and ignorant. So God, going to creation, looking for a vice regent, a Khalifa, right? Someone with whom to have this trust, this covenant to take care of creation, goes to, right, the heavens and says to the heavens, will you be the ones to have the responsibility to care and take care of and protect creation? The heavens are like, no, we can't handle it. We wouldn't assume or presume to be able to do that. And the earth, yes, the earth, how about you? Yeah, right. Wouldn't presume. Right? Mountains, wouldn't presume. The heaven, it goes to heaven or to man, to human, right? And we're like, we got this, sure, no big deal, right? Yeah. And it ends with, indeed, that is man or human, right? Was unjust and ignorant. And again, we have this idea of humans being given, right, us, right? We've been given this trust, this responsibility, but built into this sort of Quranic worldview is this skepticism. And there are many verses, of course, which speak highly of humans, right, as having this ability, but also these verses which, express a kind of skepticism towards the human ability to care for creation. And also what's interesting about this verse too is that we weren't the first that God considered, right? God went to other parts of creation first, right? So there's this way in which we can see ourselves as having this sort of special place in creation because we have been given this responsibility. But at the same time, other parts of creation were also offered it, right? Not just us, right? So that kind of puts us almost on an equal footing, right, with other parts of creation. Next slide, please. Okay, sorry, there's a lot of text here, and I'll read these as well. And so with some of these concepts, this idea of steward or Khalifa, of trust or amana, with these ideas, we have the sense in which humans have been given responsibility to care for creation, a kind of authority to care for creation. And what you also find in the Quran, and something that I think, kind of getting at, is this way in which, at the same time, while humans have this sort of special place, right? Undoubtedly, humans have a very special place in creation, special responsibility that God has given, because God loves humans, right? And has given them this responsibility. At the same time, there's a way in which Muslims today are beginning to acknowledge more and more that the Quranic view of creation is non-anthropocentric. Fun word. Non-anthropocentric. That is, the Quranic view of creation is not one in which we are the end-all, be-all, right? Where it's just about us. Like, no, this is not me. Many Muslims today would say this is not a proper reading of the Quran. And so while we as vice regents, as Khalifas, we've been given this responsibility, we've been given the earth as a resource to enjoy. I mean, there are a number of verses which talk about this. We have been given the earth as a resource to enjoy, to take advantage of. But the earth is more than that. It's not just simply for our enjoyment. It's not simply a resource for us to use to make other things out of. And so there are a couple verses which get at this. So this first one from Quran chapter 2, verse 164, says this: "Indeed, in the creation of the heavens and the earth, the alternation of the night and the day, and the great ships which sail through the sea, that which benefits people, and what God has sent down from the heavens of rain, giving life thereby to the earth after its lifelessness, and dispersing therein every kind of moving creature, his directing of the winds and the clouds, control between the heaven and the earth, are signs for people who use reason." Signs for people who use reason. So what this is getting at, and there are many Quranic verses which get at this, is the way in which all of the earth is a theater for God's glory that presents us signs that point towards God, right? Point towards something beyond itself. And so while creation, yes, is a resource for us to enjoy and use, it's also a sign to remind us that it's not about us, that we are God's, that God is ultimately, right, the creator of all. And then in terms of, and this is actually quite crucial within the Islamic tradition, within the Quran. And again, going back to this idea that I began with, the story of the Prophet Muhammad and this weeping date palm tree, that all of creation is alive. All of creation is living. So even seemingly inanimate objects, or ones that we wouldn't ascribe agency to, like trees or the sky or water, even they are living and worship God. And so, and again, there are a number of verses which express this, but here are two. So do you not see that God is exalted by whoever is within heavens and the earth, and by the birds with wings spread in flight? Each knows its prayer and exalts it, and God is knowing of what they do. So here we see this idea communicated that every aspect of creation has its own form of prayer. So humans have a form of prayer. So within the Islamic tradition, this would be seen as salat, ritual prayer, right? But birds have their own form of prayer. Trees have their own form of prayer. Rocks have their own form of prayer. And then finally, just a very short snippet of a verse, right? "And the stars and trees prostrate, bow before God." And so stars and trees bow before God, worship God, have their own prayer. So again, the sense in which for creation, it is filled with life. And while we have a certain responsibility, we are not the center of that. In every aspect of creation, even things that, again, we normally wouldn't think of as worshiping God, animals and trees in the sky, rivers, the ocean, they all also worship God. Next slide, please. And Melissa, if you want to click a couple of times, there's some animation here. Just one more time. Yeah, perfect. Thank you. Nice. So this is one view of creation which has dominated, I think, the modern West for centuries. And a number of scholars of environmental ethics and broadly of religion and the environment have spoken about this and written about this, and the sort of idea that, based on a certain reading of the Bible, that of course many Christians and Jews, but many Christians today are arguing against. But it's sort of in the modern period, a certain reading of the creation account where humans have been given dominion of the earth. And the sense in which humans are almost separate from nature, right? It's like man versus nature. We're separate from nature, we're at the top, and it is for our dominion. Right? It is for us to extract whatever resources we need for our economies at whatever cost. And so in a way that, humans have been kind of imagined in this sort of way of thinking about the world is, again, us as, almost separate from nature. Right? Again, sort of like man versus nature. You have the nature, but we are something separate from that. And Melissa, if you want to click one time, perfect. So within a Quranic perspective, this would be incorrect. Right? This would be incorrect. And it's not that we are separate from nature, but humans are, of course, one with nature. Like we are nature. Like we are literally made of debris and stardust, right? Going back to the Big Bang. And so while on the one hand, within a Quranic worldview, yes, humans have a unique responsibility, a unique authority, right, over creation. Right? That you do absolutely find that in the Quran. But at the same time, you also find within the Quran this idea that while humans, yes, have a special kind of responsibility and authority within creation, still we are one with creation. We are one with creation. We are in nature. We are not above nature. Right? We are a part of the natural world and paradigm. And so, and this is something that today within kind of across religious traditions, across secular traditions, ways of thinking about the environment. I think one theme that you see people kind of going to are ways of thinking about the human place in creation, where humans are seen as a part of a broader unity, and a lot of these communities are looking to indigenous traditions, like Native American traditions, for example, but indigenous traditions from different parts of the world, which are really good historically at thinking of humans as maybe having a special place in creation, but also being alongside of all of creation. Right? We are one with nature. We are a part of nature. And again, you certainly find this in the Quran. Next slide, please. And perfect. Okay, so there's just a few concepts from the Quran that, again, that Muslim thinkers, communities are drawing on today. Sort of think about a Muslim environmentalism. And what you've had happen over the last probably 30 years, so since like the 1990s, and especially in the 2000s and continuing to today, is the development within Islamic law of Islamic environmental law. And of course, I'm happy to answer any questions about any aspect of Islam, including Islamic law, in a Q&A session, because I know there are, we hear a lot of things about Sharia law, and Muslims want to impose Sharia law on communities. A number of state legislatures in this country, including Florida, have passed laws that forbid the imposition of Sharia law, even though no American Muslim community wants to do that. Right, so it's often used as a sort of fear tactic, kind of talking about Sharia. So there might be questions about sort of Islamic law in general, which of course I'm happy to answer. But there are different kinds of Islamic law, like focusing on different areas. And so one that's developed, as I said, over the last probably 30 years or so, is Islamic environmental law, or what's called fiqh al-biya. And fiqh is another term often used for Islamic law, and biya for the environment. And so there are kind of three concepts that are drawn on for this. One is called the aims of the law, or maqasid al-sharia. Another one is the common good, right? Kind of legislating kind of with concerns for the common good, which is called maslaha. And then also this idea of rights, which of course is, we are very familiar with, perhaps, of haqq. And so within this idea of the aims of the law, so for centuries now, a number of Muslim legal thinkers will kind of talk about Islamic law as having many parts, Um, it's a very expansive sort of methodology, very expansive corpus, but it can really kind of be boiled down to like 5 purposes, like ultimately 5 purposes that Islamic law is trying to achieve. And that is to protect or preserve religion, life, the intellect, lineage or like offspring, like children, and then property. And so this idea of the aims of the law has been used to kind of allow Muslim communities to sort of reinterpret and adapt Islamic law to different times and places. Because like what it means to preserve life or intellect 200 years ago in Lebanon, for example, or in Singapore or in Malaysia, is going to be different from what it means to protect these things in Senegal today or here in Florida. And so it often has been used as a kind of a tool to kind of adapt Islamic law to different conditions and times. But in terms of Islamic environmental law, this idea of preserving life has been drawn on that, an objective, a fundamental kind of aim of kind of Muslim ethics of Islamic law is to preserve life. And this idea has been sort of expanded to include not just like human life, which maybe, 500 years ago or longer, the focus would be on preserving human life. But now this is understood much more broadly to include all of life. So it's an objective, like a purpose of Islamic law is to preserve all life, not just human life. With the common good, a maslaha. So we have this sort of idea, which you also find in English common law, of the commons. The sort of idea that there are certain things, often natural, that no one can lay claim to as their own private property. Certain things which should be protected for the public, because everyone needs access to them to thrive. So often, whether it's certain forest or land or water, rivers, kind of within English common law, these things have often been spoken of as being these sort of common goods that everyone should have access to. We find something very similar within Islamic law. This idea that the common good is something that we should think about when we are deriving Islamic law or legal conclusions. In one hadith, right? So again, in a report of the saying and doing of Prophet Muhammad, one hadith that kind of like Muslim environmental thinkers will kind of draw on is this, where he says people are partners in 3: water, vegetation, and fire. And so what legal thinkers, Muslim ethicists will take this to mean is that everyone is a partner, everyone shares and has a right to water, to vegetation, right, to forest, to the land, to cultivate produce. And fire, what this is meaning is like fuel. So like minerals, things you get from under the earth, right, which you could, in Prophet Muhammad's day, which would then be used to make fire. And so this is sort of getting at that stuff under the earth, like minerals. So here we have Muhammad kind of getting at this idea that there are certain things in creation, right, that they're common good, they're for the benefit of everybody, and no one has any right to say that that's mine and only mine. And then finally, there was this idea of rights. That's a big topic. God has rights, certain rights. We have certain rights as humans. What's interesting about this too is that within Islamic law, animals have rights. And so there are treatises written on the treatment of animals where you have these ideas, and you find this also in the Jewish tradition when it comes to Jewish law and the halakha. But within Islamic law, you'll find kind of in parts of like legal manuals which talk about this, you'll find where they'll talk about how you care for a domesticated animal. And there's certain things that you have to provide for your domesticated animal. So like, for example, that animal has a right to your time, effort, and money. So you have to spend time, effort, and money to care for that animal And no matter if that animal is benefit to you or not. If that animal gets older, you can't just say, well, he or she's going to die anyways, so I'm not going to bother spending money. Like, no, you have an obligation to care for that animal, even when it's diseased, even when it's old. You have to, another kind of interesting obligation that humans have is to not kill the young in front of their mother. So you shouldn't kill the young animal in front of its mother. Animals have a right, domestic animals have a right to their own shelter and water source separate from others. When you kill them, you must do so in a way that's humane. You should never break their bones, only in ways that are as painless as possible. And so these are rights that animals have, actually, and duties and obligations that we have to them. And so from kind of all of these things, so Melissa, if you want to click once. And sorry, one more time. So from kind of all of these kind of legal principles and even Quranic ideas, we can get support for two concepts which today are very prevalent in environmental thinking. And that is this idea of environmental justice and then the rights of nature. So with environmental justice, it's this sort of idea that when we think about caring for the environment, it's taking into account that often exploitation of the environment involves exploitation of human communities. So, for example, often landfills and mining operations are conducted close to poor communities who don't have the ability to fight them, and often those communities are communities of color. So we have this idea of environmental racism, right, which has kind of become quite prevalent, which is connected to this idea of environmental justice. So looking at how protecting the environment also intersects with ideas of class, right? So protecting those who are impoverished, who don't have the power to speak for themselves. And also, this also intersects with race and racism. And so this idea of environmental justice is very prevalent today. So we're like protecting the environment is connected to class and race. And then also this idea of the rights of nature, which last like 20 years, environmental law has become also prevalent, where thinking about trees and rivers and the sky as having rights themselves. And so in this really interesting kind of early goings of this part of environmental law, also often drawing on indigenous traditions, kind of begin globally, but also here in America. And you can kind of potentially get there within sort of a Quranic worldview where, if every living creature, if trees, right, worship and pray to God, right, then we can think of them as having the kind of right or ability, or we have a duty to protect them. Right? They are worshiping God. They are signs for us to remind us of God's beauty and majesty. And so therefore we should protect them. Right? We have an obligation to protect them, and they have a right to be protected. So this is kind of interesting. We can talk more about that as well. Okay, so Melissa, click first forward slide. So I'm near the end of sort of my comments. So I've spoken about some, ideas from the Quran, how they've been translated into aspects of Islamic environmental law. So what I want to close with is just to give you a couple of examples of this sort of in operation today. And so, what's kind of interesting about Islamic law, and this is, a surprise to many people, and it's that in almost every single Muslim majority country, Islamic law is not the law of the land. So most Muslim majority countries, almost all of them, were colonized. They're in African Asia, and they were colonized by the French, British, Dutch, Spanish, Libyans. And what those colonial powers did is they put in their own legal system. And so after the independence of all these countries in the 60s and 70s, 50s, 60s, 70s, they retained those European colonial systems, kind of colonial European legal codes. So places like Indonesia, Malaysia, Senegal, Morocco, Egypt, the British controlled Egypt until 1952. They all have European legal codes for criminal law, civil law. There's one part of law, it's called family law, so dealing with marriage, inheritance. And often you'll find Sharia courts like in that one little slice of the legal system, but that's it. Right? So what that means is that in almost everywhere in the world, Islamic law is something that the state is not really involved with. And so, so when it comes to these sort of pronouncements by scholars, so sometimes they're called fatwas, so like a fatwa, maybe you've probably heard this, kind of infamous fatwa from Ayatollah Khomeini for Salman Rushdie back in the 80s. All a fatwa is a non-binding legal opinion, sort of like a lawyer writing an opinion saying, here's how I think this should be understood legally. That's all it is. And so some fatwas have been authored by, kind of environmental fatwas have been authored by different groups, individuals. This is a kind of fatwa, and it's called the Islamic Declaration of Global Climate Change. It was put together in 2015. So this was around the time of the Paris Climate Conference. And also Pope Francis came out with a very famous encyclical Laudato Si. This is sort of his definitive statement on the environment. Very, very important sort of document in Christian environmental thinking. And so, a number of religious scholars, civil society leaders, nonprofits, all came together in Istanbul for a couple of days in 2015, and they came up with this document to kind of coincide with Pope Francis, Laudato Si, the Paris Climate Conference, and sort of saying this is sort of like an Islamic, right, kind of view of this. And so I have a couple of sort of excerpts from this, beginning this with a basic, acknowledgement that God has created the universe and all its diversity, richness, and vitality. And then, Melissa, if you could forward one slide. So we see again this idea of corruption or facade. So again, these are just a couple of excerpts from it. So we recognize that we recognize the corruption that humans have caused on Earth in our relentless pursuit of economic growth and consumption. Right? It talks about its consequences, global climate change, contamination of the atmosphere, soil erosion, deforestation, desertification, impairment of the ecosystem's benefits and services, et cetera, right? So this idea of corruption, facade, right? Like I talked about a little while ago, we see it kind of actually operationalized with this fatwa here to kind of speak out about how climate change today is a result of human corruption of the earth. Next slide. And then the final part from this fatwa, as it were, that I'll share with you is, again, this sort of idea that creation is not just about us, right? It's not just about us. It says, we recognize that we are but a minuscule part of the divine order. Yet within that order, we are exceptionally powerful beings and have the responsibility to establish good and avert evil in every way we can. We also recognize that we are but one of the multitude of living beings with whom we share the earth. We have no right to abuse the creation. Intelligence and conscience leads us, or should lead us, as our faith commands, to treat all things with care and awe, and taqwa of the Creator, compassion, or rahmah, and the utmost good, ihsan. And another verse in the Quran, which again speaks to all this. There's no animal on the earth, nor any bird that wings its flight, but is a community like you. So God's speaking this right to humans. You're not the only ones, right? You have communities who care for each other. Next slide. And finally, they kind of get to the nuts and bolts where they're actually calling on the different parties of the Paris Climate Accord the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, and they're calling on them to actually make policy changes. Right? So again, drawing on Islamic values and ideas, calling on these parties to make actual policy changes to deal with climate change. Okay, next slide. And this is the last one I'll show you, and I'll be done. So actually in Indonesia, which is the world's largest Muslim majority country, it's also the world's fourth largest democracy. In Indonesia, there's been actually a lot of exciting work done in the area of Islamic environmental law, a lot of it because Indonesia is dealing with a lot of repercussions of climate change, with sea level rise, deforestation, pollution from mining operations by Western corporations. And so they're suffering from a lot of the effects of climate change and things associated with climate change. And so they've been at the forefront, kind of their basically legal scholars have been at the forefront of really kind of rethinking Islamic law in a way to kind of inform Islamic environmental law. And so this is one example of a fatwa from 2014 called The Protection of Endangered Species to Maintain Balanced Ecosystems, right? So this idea of a balanced ecosystem, right? Mizan, this idea of maintaining a proper balance. And we see here kind of a couple of claims they start off with. They speak about certain endangered species in Indonesia: tigers, rhinos, elephants, orangutans. And then it says, but humans created by God as a vice regent on earth, right? Khalifa fil ard, who carry out the mandate, and he was responsible for the prosperity of all creatures. Next slide, please. And so we see here, so we have been given this responsibility as Khalifas, that all living organisms are created by Allah, by God, in order to maintain a balanced ecosystem, and are subjugated to the interest of sustainable human welfare. Therefore, humans must protect and preserve, right, the balance of the ecosystem so as not to cause damage, right? Again, it's the idea of facade. So this is just an example, another example of taking these ideas of corruption, of vice regency, of balance, and kind of putting them into action, right? Calling for policy change to deal with climate change. And so, just in closing, when it comes to kind of contemporary Muslim thinking about the environment, I mean, there are many rich ways in which Islamic tradition can be drawn on and is being drawn on. And, again, I think kind of fundamental to this is this idea of, as I've said, a few times, we as humans, yes, we have been given a special place and authority, but again, it's not just about us. All of creation is alive, and all of creation has rights, not just us, because all of creation is involved in the worship of God, not just us. And so, with that really, of course, I can have an entire course on this because these ideas, made their way into Islamic poetry, Islamic art, Islamic philosophy in very rich ways. I could talk a lot about Rumi, right, and Islamic mysticism, and how these informed a lot of kind of mystical thinkings about the oneness of being, right? Like we are all one, right? We are all this idea of interdependence that you find in mystical traditions in Christianity and Buddhism, right? You find this in Islam as well, right? We are all one. We are all interconnected. And you find that in the Quran, you find that in the aspects of Islam. So I'll just go ahead and stop there and look forward to questions that you might have later.